What is up, my Canadian cousins? Welcome back to the channel. So, yeah, a little over a month ago, I did a video about Canadians that joined up either North or South, mostly North, in the American Civil War. And this topic has fascinated me for a long time, the cross-border exchange of soldiers in our militaries in certain wars. Now, I had not known about that prior to my doing this channel and delving deeper into Canadian history. And in this video, I'm just going to close the loop on this topic. I'm going to explore Canadians that served in the Vietnam War, particularly because some of them are still alive, and I think it's important to remember them. You know, I've known for a very long time that some 40,000 Americans crossed the border to join the Canadian military during World War I because we got into the war so late. That, you know, there was an opportunity over the course of years for some 40,000 people to join in it. And the cause, they had a lot of various reasons, some probably adventurism, or some definitely were, you know, fighting for a cause. So this also happened in World War II, going both ways, by the way. You know, of course, Canada was in World War II earlier, right from the beginning, and so Americans joined, but we entered the war sooner along the timeline than we did in World War I. So I think, let me see, I have it here. It looks like about 10,000 Americans served in the Canadian Army during World War II. And after Pearl Harbor, interestingly enough, there were Canadians who crossed the border to serve in the American Army. I guess, I'm not really sure why, given that their armed forces were already engaged in the conflict, but perhaps there was maybe more of a desire to fight in the Pacific theater, which, you know, the United States was certainly going to be more proportionally involved in than any other country. Who knows? But in any case, before I get to the main video, I'm going to do an abridged version of it. I will, you know, sort of edit it for time to get the gist of it, because I just can't do an hour-long video. I don't think anybody would stick through it. With my commentary, it's going to be an hour and a half or so. But I will drop the link in the description for you to be able to watch the entire thing on your own if you'd like to. I think we'll get enough of the point. All right, my friends, I'll see you on the flip side.
Either reflect or take into account the proximity of the United States. Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly or even tempered is the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt.
Still true today, right, my friends?
A lot of people think that Canada wasn't in a war from Korea to Afghanistan, but there was a generation that served in Vietnam.
Not to mention peacekeeping missions.
This is a picture of my friend Larry that was killed in action in Vietnam, and a few more of my pictures and paraphernalia. This is a parachute after I got out of the service. Did some skydiving. It's an old military parachute. The last jump I made was 2 years ago. I was 70 years old then.
Who's there in the picture?
That's me when I went to jump school. My name is Rob Purvis. I was born here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I'm a Canadian who fought in Vietnam.
So before this part started, there in the original video, there's somewhat of a lengthy explanation about how the Vietnam War started in the history And I'm going to assume that you all have familiarity with it, and that really isn't the point of this video. So, but again, if you want to watch the full thing, the link is in the description.
Did you always want to be a soldier?
No, it just sort of happened. I guess it spur of the moment thing, and me and my friends decided to join the American Army.
Who were the guys?
Butch Buffy, his brother Billy Buffy, and Larry Collins. I grew up with Larry, Billy, and Butch. We grew up all in this neighborhood since we were maybe 6 years old. We went to grade school and high school together, and I would spend a lot of time at Butch and Billy's house and Larry's house. We were all part of sort of all an extended family in each other's houses. During that time, everybody had 4 or 5 kids in their house, but it was a real small, close-knit community.
Grew up in a neighborhood like that.
My name is Ron Parks. I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba in 1943. I think I had quite the normal childhood. I had, a few friends, and we get in a little bit of trouble once in a while, but nothing serious.
So, 2 guys from Winnipeg so far. Well, if you include the friends that the prior gentleman just mentioned. We've got, 3 of them? 5 people from Winnipeg so far.
I had a relatively boring childhood. My father and 4 of my uncles and 1 aunt served in World War II. And my grandfather served in World War I. While I was in high school,
I'm going to predict where he's going with this, because I think that this was true of a lot of Americans who volunteered in the early days of Vietnam. They had, their fathers fought in the Second World War, grandfathers in the First World War, and they just kind of felt it was their generation's turn to do something, similarly heroic, because that's certainly how those wars were remembered.
I was in the militia in a tank regiment here in Winnipeg, the Fort Garry Horse. I had wanted to make a career of the Canadian Armed Forces, but when we graduated from school, a buddy and myself went to join, and we were told that there was a waiting list to get in because the ranks were frozen because of John Diefenbaker's austerity program. Being 19 years old, we didn't really want to wait 6 months to a year to maybe get into the service. So one of us had the bright idea, let's check the Americans out. And I guess it was probably a slow morning for the recruiting sergeant. He was sitting there at his desk with his feet on his desk, reading the newspaper. And when we walked in, he looked over his paper and he said, "What can I do for you boys?" And we said, "We're down from Canada, we want to join the Army." And the newspaper went flying, he jumped to his feet, he come running over to us and shook our hand. He said, "Sit down, you Canadians make good soldiers." I did my basic at Fort Leonard.
They certainly had that reputation, and it was well known to the American military based on your performances in the Korea, not to mention, not to forget the Forgotten War, Korea, as well as the 2 World Wars.
In Missouri, I did my artillery training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. From there, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia for paratrooper training. And from Georgia, I went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is the home of the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles. And for the next couple of years, I was a proud Screaming Eagle.
A very storied division of the U.S. Army.
Whoa, Rob, I've got to ask. Why would you go down to the States and enlist? Were you afraid of communism?
No, I think maybe that had a little bit to do with it. Part of it was we watched the news every night at 6 o'clock, and it was the war in Vietnam. And I believed that we went down there and signed up because we were young, and our fathers were all veterans, and we thought we were going to be helping the people of South Vietnam.
Yeah, that's sort of a sad comment in hindsight. Of course, this is all part of the policy of containment. And while I'm not going to get into, because we could, make hours-long videos over the policy of containment and the many mistakes that were made and bad outcomes of that, supporting dictatorial, non-democratic people just because they were anti-communist. And then of course the whole debacle in Vietnam and everything. We could point to what a disaster that policy was in many ways, but the concept was a good one, and the concept, especially back then, before knowing what we know now, I can understand how a lot of, especially young men, were persuaded that it was the right thing to do.
Vietnam came along in '65. We actually went by ship. We left San Francisco under the Golden Gate Bridge and 20 days across the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
It was
He got in very early, 1965. My father was in the U.S. Army in the late 60s, but he didn't serve in Vietnam. He was lucky enough. He was in Army intelligence and served in NATO. Cold Warrior in Germany. My brother was actually born in Munich, Germany, where my parents lived for a time while my father served.
Just looking place until we got ashore. There was bugs, it was hot, it was back in the Middle Ages. They were out there in the rice fields with their oxen and doing everything by hand. And, they had nothing. We checked out some huts that they're living in, there's nothing there. A hole in the center of the roof for the smoke to go out. A couple of beds that weren't, we consider beds, and some rugs on the floor, and that was it. They were very poor people. And the war was making it much worse for them because we were destroying crops. If our infantry units came under fire from the village, they called us to place artillery rounds into the village. After firing a few shots, the enemy were probably gone by the time we laid the artillery in. So we destroyed a village, and who are the people mad at? Mad at us because we destroyed the village. When you're taking fire from somewhere, you have to fire back. Simple as that.
It really sucks. I mean, in so many wars, the civilian population get caught in the middle, and they certainly did here. They were used by the Viet Cong. They were used by the South Vietnamese government. They were used by us. Sometimes they chose sides and were certainly, it was certainly right for soldiers to be afraid that, a child with a shoe shine box could have a bomb in it and kill them. But at the same time, I think the majority of people just wanted to live their lives, and they just got caught in the middle. And for so long, I mean, obviously the American involvement in Vietnam wasn't the first. The French fought there first, and, the world wars affected them, and the Chinese were there. I mean, it was just a country that had suffered for a very, very long time.
First battle we were involved in.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but I know that Canada took a lot of refugees from the Vietnam War, as did we, and I know some of them. I know some that are the progeny of those refugees. There was, where I went to grad school in central Pennsylvania, there was a big community of Vietnamese refugees.
It was on Operation Gibraltar. One of our infantry battalions landed right in the middle of 3 battalions of Viet Cong. The first lift came in, not a shot was fired. The second lift of helicopters come in, 24 out of 28 helicopters were hit, 4 couldn't take off. And it was actually not a battalion, it was about a company and a half of our airborne troops who were caught right in the middle. They were totally surrounded. And later on in the afternoon, darkness fell. We couldn't get them resupplied. We were listening on the radio frequencies to their calls for help. They wanted ammunition, water, barrels for the machine gun, and they were helpless to do anything. So the next morning, we got helicopters to bring our artillery in closer. We fired 1,000 rounds per gun in a 24-hour period,
Wow.
putting fire around where those paratroopers were surrounded.
Jeez.
We ruined the recoil mechanisms in our howitzers. We were pounding them for 24 hours, and finally they broke off. They found close to 300 bodies on the field. How many were dragged away, we don't know how many wounded. But we lost 13 paratroopers killed, 33 wounded. And at that time, that was the biggest loss in a single battle in the war. The United States Army at that time was better trained, better equipped, better led than it had ever been in the history of the United States. We had everything we needed. We had the best weapons, we had good leadership. The biggest problem for our commanders, I believe, was getting to fight a war that they weren't used to. And it's a typical thing that the military trains for the last war they fought. This one was totally different from World War II. So some of the ideas they had, the methods, might have worked in Europe and in WW2, but it sure as hell didn't work in Vietnam.
No, he's right, and he would know, right? You know, famously, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and it became apparent that the government knew at some point that the war was unwinnable. I mean, how do you beat an enemy that's willing to take casualties at a 5-to-1 ratio to you? You know, they had been fighting for their independence. You know, whether you agreed with the form of government that they chose, and again, the geopolitics of the time, it's understandable. But you know, you can't beat an enemy that just will never give up. That's fanatical. That's willing to take those kind of losses and outlast you. We've seen it time and again throughout history.
Back in 1967, in the late fall, we decided to enlist in the American Army. So we drove down to Grand Forks, North Dakota, U.S. Army recruiting station, and they were very glad to see us, and they gave us all the paperwork to fill in. We had to come back and get medical, police record check, and go to the American consulate to get a visa. That took probably a month, 3 weeks to get all that done, and it was right in the fall. And we decided we weren't going to go back until after Christmas because we didn't want to go in the Army and right at Christmas time and disrupt it for our families and everything. So we stayed home for Christmas.
Rob had to get American citizenship because the Foreign Enlistment Act banned Canadians from serving in foreign militaries. The American...
Okay, this is what I was talking about. So I was a little confused when I was listening to him just talk about getting a visa, and I thought, oh, maybe I was wrong about that. But no, yeah, you had to get citizenship.
Though, found a way around this. They set up recruiting offices in Washington and New York, specifically designed to give Canadians a visa and U.S. citizenship. Armed with dual citizenship, the Canadian could volunteer for the U.S. Army.
Anybody try to talk you out of enlisting?
Yeah, I guess when we first told everybody we were going to go join the American Army, nobody was especially our family wasn't too thrilled about it. Now you can understand that now. But we were young and adventurous, and we just wanted to go see the world. We all went together under they called it the Canadian Body Plan. We went to Fort Lewis, Washington, and we all went together for basic training. After that, we all got split up. We all went our individual ways. Actually, we all ended up in the four corners of the United States. Larry Collins went into the infantry. He stayed in Fort Lewis. I went down to Fort Ord, California. Butch, I believe he went to Fort Benning, Georgia. And Billy went to Maryland.
So what he's talking about here, I had read one time that there was the notion, so they went through training together, the buddy system. The Canadians sometimes went through training together, I think is what he was saying, but they got split up once they got put into units, and I think there was contemplation at some point to form Canadian units, but the US government eventually decided against that because it would create too much of a diplomatic problem between United States and Canada. It would look bad from the Canadian point of view to have, full Canadian units when Canada, explicitly decided not to join the war.
Larry was the first to get orders to go, and shortly after that, Butch and Billy went to Vietnam, signed down to Special Forces in Panama Canal. I spent a year there. When Larry got killed, that's when I volunteered for Vietnam, and a couple months later, I ended up going to Vietnam. I went to the 4th Infantry Division in Pleiku, and from there I volunteered to go to a Ranger Company. The Ranger Company was a small unit. We did all the long-range recon patrols for the 4th Infantry Division. Basically, we had a 4-man team.
Well, this guy was serious. He trained for Special Forces, and I saw he had the Special Forces patch on his jacket, but he was also a Ranger. So this guy served in some pretty elite units in the U.S. Army.
And they would send us out on a mission. It would probably last 4 or 5 days in the jungle. Either we went on a recon or an ambush mission, but most of the time it was recon, just checking out the areas and finding it was there. And then they would come back and get us when our 4 or 5 days were up.
Is there anything difficult you want to talk about?
Yeah, there was always lots of rough nights, or sometimes I didn't know if I'd be live to see the sunrise again. We lost quite a few friends there, and after a while you didn't try to get too personal with people because you didn't know if they were going to make it or not, or you were going to make it. So part of the thing for a while, we called everybody Jack. Everybody was Jack, so...
Did you want to know their names?
No, we just called everybody Jack.
Yeah, I mean, that's heartbreaking. These, as I've said multiple times on this channel, I don't love war. I like covering war history. It's extremely important, but I am very well aware of the horror, and that I never want to glorify it. I hope that comes across.
And everybody in our company was a volunteer, so we sort of had the cream of the crop. Everybody I talked to, when they found out I was Canadian, they thought we're all crazy. What are you doing here? But after a while, it didn't really matter where you're from or what color you were in our company. Everybody was just got together, and it was survival, and it didn't matter what your nationality, where you're from. Everybody was a GI.
A true band of brothers. So I've just skipped over a part where it kind of went into the history of the Tet Offensive, where the proverbial hit the fan. And so this is what I guess these soldiers are going to be discussing.
After, when Larry got killed, it was a big shock. It wasn't fun anymore. It was all over. It was down to fighting and staying alive. Larry was killed in an ambush in May of '69. I'm not really sure what happened, but I think he was coming back from a village late at night, and he walked through a Arvin ambush, and he was killed, him and a couple of other guys. I was sort of devastated. I got sent a telegram about him being killed, but I didn't get it for 3 weeks later. And when I got the telegram, I went and talked to my commanding officer, and they arranged for me to come home. But I arrived home the day after the funeral. I didn't get home till Sunday, and Larry's funeral was on Saturday.
I'm not sure if I mentioned it, because in the beginning I was talking about, the cross-border serving during the World Wars, and I had mentioned that some 35,000 American-born Americans, 40,000 in total, served in across the border to Canada to serve in World War I before we got in the war. A similar number of Canadians served in the Vietnam War, 35 plus thousand people. It's a lot. And I know at least one of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Could be more, but I'm aware of one. I cannot remember his name. I will certainly insert it here when I edit. And let's take a moment to remember him.
You know, you were basically ignored, man. Who cares? So what? So for a vast majority of us, we just never spoke of it for 20 odd years later until we formed our Canadian Vietnam Veterans Association.
So that's interesting, and that's something I was wondering about because, a lot of, obviously, the U.S. was quite divided over the war. Ultimately, it was very unpopular here, but, there were war protesters who did what they needed to do in good conscience, but there were people who, really mistreated the soldiers when they returned. And so he said, like some people called them baby killers, as he said. And I was wondering what kind of treatment they got when they returned to Canada. Obviously, it's different because the nation wasn't in the war, and it had really created a lot of divisiveness here and a lot of problems here. And for Canadians, maybe it was just sort of an interesting aside. Okay, this probably the only person I know that served in the Vietnam War is in my town, and interesting aside. At least this is his experience. Maybe you all know somebody who had a different experience, and if so, I'd like to talk about it in the comments.
So you kept everything bottled up all those years?
All those years. Once you've realized nobody wanted to talk about it, nobody was interested, just keep it to yourself.
The other thing I wonder is what kind of role do they play, or how are they viewed or incorporated into Canadian veterans groups? We have the American Legion, we have the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I know you have similar organizations. I can't remember what they're called, but I wonder how the Vietnam vets are thought of in those groups, and do they participate?
It took me 24 hours to fly out back from Vietnam to the States. I out-processed out of the Army. It took roughly another 24 hours. And 48 hours out of Vietnam, I was back in the streets of Winnipeg. It was all over. That was a real culture shock for me.
I bet.
It was just really strange. I hadn't slept for probably a week, and I still couldn't sleep. You're wired, and it just like a dream happened. It was over. It ended abruptly. But after I come back here, there was nobody to talk to. There was nobody, nowhere to go. The Legion wouldn't accept us. Even if there was no Vietnam veterans here. There's nobody to talk to, so I just really didn't talk about it.
Well, I guess that partially answers my question, at least as of then, but I wonder if it's the same now.
Did you bottle everything up?
I guess I did. Well, there was nobody to talk to about it, so I didn't talk about it was really difficult. Nobody would understand what you went through anyway, so we just didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about it. And I went to school under the GI Bill, so they helped pay my way through university. So I spent the next 3-4 years just reading books, and that was sort of my decompression, unwinding process after I came back.
That's interesting. That's something I had never thought of, and I'm glad he mentioned that. The GI Bill was GI Bill of Rights that came from, I believe it started after World War II, but it provides veterans with certain benefits that allow them to restart their lives, and one of them is paid for education. And I'm very glad that those benefits were extended to these gentlemen from Canada. Of course, why wouldn't they be? Well, you know, why? Because this world isn't always fair.
I'm never embarrassed to tell anybody I served in Vietnam, but most of the time I didn't talk about it until, you know, I get to know people. I don't know whether it was right or wrong what we did, but we went and did it, and I am proud of my service. I went, I signed up, and I served. I did my 3 years. My only regret is Larry being killed. I really regret that, and it was a total shock to me and very disheartening. Especially on Memorial Day, Remembrance Day, I think about Larry and all the other friends I lost there.
You mentioned Memorial Day and Remembrance Day. I've covered these topics before. If you want to check out my Remembrance Day video last year, my Memorial Day video, Veterans Day is the same day as Remembrance Day. He has 2 days with which to remember his friends, and probably every other day of the year.
This is back in the 80s. The first situation I had is the middle of the night I would find myself at the front door looking out the window. I didn't know how long I'd been there, but I would kind of snap out of it somewhere along the way. I go back to bed. But I found this happening time again and again and again. There was nothing I could do about it or nothing I thought about it. I just thought I'm being a little weird. What happened next was I go to bed at night and I wake up in the morning with a loaded rifle beside my bed.
God.
And no knowledge of getting up and loading a rifle. And one morning my wife Connie was making the bed. She lifted up my pillow and I had a hunting knife under the pillow, not in a scabbard, just the knife itself. And she kind of freaked out. What if you killed me during the night? You know, I wouldn't do that, but you know, I had no idea why that knife was there.
I mean, of course he wouldn't, but what if it was an accident? What if he was having a nightmare and he thought a Viet Cong soldier was next to him? You know, and that's why, you know, these guys, these young men went to war in good faith. No matter what you think of the war, we can see the lasting effect it had on them, and they need to not be forgotten. They need to be taken care of.
Yeah, I think everybody that went through that Vietnam experience had issues with PTSD. Some it affected a lot more than others, and depending on your experiences you had over there, totally different. I know a lot of veterans are really affected by it, affects their daily lives, and it's really horrible. And a lot of them got into drugs and alcohol trying to suppress the issues and created a lot of problems.
I was just about to say that. I also grew up near a U.S. veterans hospital that had a psychiatric branch to it, and it was across several acres of woods from our neighborhood, and sometimes these poor guys, Vietnam veterans, with psychiatric issues would sort of show up in our neighborhood, having wandered away from the grounds, and the VA police would have to come pick them back up. It's very sad. A lot of time in my youth going with my father, who every Sunday would wheel disabled veterans who were at the VA hospital to Mass. I hated doing it. To be honest with you, I hated doing it. It scared me. The hospital was upsetting. The smells, the sights, the people who were not in their right mind. But in hindsight, I'm so glad that my father gave me that experience.
Where PTSD was coined from studies with Vietnam veterans and the after effects of the war in Vietnam. I have a lot of issues with PTSD. I get flashbacks and issues of not sleeping. Like I said, it affects everybody. Sort of maybe took it personal, like they were protesting against the GIs that were there. I think it should have been more focused protesting against the government, not the troops that were serving there. People don't realize how tumultuous it was. It split families. A lot of those fellows that come up here that they can't ever talk to their fathers again, and a lot of them never went back. It was very difficult for them too. I can understand some of the draft dodgers coming up, but I didn't like the deserters. I thought that once you signed and take an oath of allegiance, you should fulfill that, and that's what I did. The kids today don't realize what it was like to be 18 years old back then. In the States, everybody was getting their draft notice during high school, and their friends had got them 3, 4, 6 months earlier, and they were all coming home in body bags. They were going to their funerals. Now it was their turn. It was a really rocky time.
Have you ever met any of them?
Yeah, I've met some draft dodgers, and people came up here, and like I said, I don't have too much issues with them. You know, we all made decisions, and maybe I didn't agree with a lot of it, but said they don't agree with me, but I can learn to live with that, and that's fine.
I don't know what to say, but I just respect that man very much for that attitude. That's an interesting statistic that 40,000 Americans immigrated to Canada, mostly draft dodgers and deserters. A near equal number of Canadians went to serve in the war. It's just an interesting coincidence.
My full name is Paul Dufel. I was born in Winnipeg. In 1969, I decided to go join the U.S. Armed Forces. My dad, half of his, there were 13 kids, I believe, and half of the family were born in Spencer, Massachusetts. Dad was part of the other half born in Canada. All I heard at home in my young days is how beautiful the United States are, and the United States can do no harm.
So that's interesting. I mean, I suppose that probably a lot of people did have cross-border family situations that served in the war.
I put in my 3 years. After that, I signed up for an extra year in the North Dakota National Guard. So I got a 4-year credit of active duty. And that's when I put in a request to go to Vietnam. So it was totally volunteer. Started with the 4th Infantry Division in An Khê. And from there, the 4th Infantry Division deactivated, and they shipped me out to the Americal Division in the Chu Lai region, which is all in the central Vietnam, Central Highlands. We were good to the orphanage. A lot of them were admiration kids. We'd buy them things and drinks and food and toys and things like that we could get for them. But myself, I felt like I owed something to the United States of America, because I was in the era of the Cold War, and I knew if it wasn't for the United States of America, we'd be under the rule of the Russian bear. And I've always thought that we weren't doing our fair share in Canada, and this was my opportunity to thank them. And I was ready to give my life.
Wow.
And not that I would not give my life for Canada. I love Canada. But there's something special about the United States for me. It's just me. I'm red, white, and blue blood. I'm very proud to have served in the United States of America, the United States Armed Forces, and in Vietnam. There was the war at that time, and no, I have no regrets.
Would you do it all over again?
Yes, and even at my old age, I would.
Even now today?
Yes, I would go. I'd leave right now to help the United States of America. Even though I'm an old man now, I would not mind putting a turret on my wheelchair to fight for the United States.
I guess it was in the fall of '85. Somebody in Winnipeg here laid a wreath on behalf of Canadian and Vietnam veterans. And I was intrigued, and I got a hold of this fellow, and so did a couple other veterans here, and we got together and we had coffee. That's how I came up with the idea, is, wow, there's more veterans out here. And after 16 years, I started talking about it, and I couldn't stop, and I came up with the idea, well, there's got to be more of us out there. We sort of talked about going to see the wall in Washington, and says, well, let's try and get everybody to go. So I started writing letters to the editor, and I sent it to all the major cities across Canada, and that's how the Canadian Vietnam Veterans Association started. I got a lot of
Good for you, my friend. Good for you.
media exposure, and it sort of really took off and went viral. And when we went to Washington, we had over 100 Canadian veterans and 2 Gold Star mothers that accompanied us on this trip. And after I found out later, there was lots that never heard about us until it was over. We had no money. I had no money for a budget. I had nothing, just whatever we could get off radio and TV, free publicity.
Were you shocked by the response?
I was. It just got more and more, and I was really elated that we got so many veterans that came out and wanted to go on this trip. I met Jan Scruggs.
Thank God that people responded in that way. That's heartening to hear. Have any of you ever been to the Vietnam War Memorial in DC? It's extremely powerful in its simplistic design.
He was the originator of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and he acted as our master of ceremony at our little service we had in Washington. We got a really good reception when we went to Washington. All the major networks were there filming it, and to make the news in Washington, it's a big accomplishment because they have protests and stuff going on every single day there.
I met Rob in April of 1986. He had previously sent ads out to newspapers wanting to know if there was any other Canadians that had served in the U.S. Armed Forces as he had and his friends. And somebody got the word to me. I ended up coming to maybe the second or third meeting that the CVVA had, and I've been a member ever since, and damn proud of it. We've helped a lot of Canadians that didn't know they could access their service benefits, and a number of different things.
You know,
a lot of times,
on top
even
of
if
the emotional support, that's very interesting. That people didn't know that they could access service benefits. That's hugely important. It's hugely important.
there's loan benefits, there's mortgage benefits, there's educational benefits.
Chapters set up in most of the major cities across Canada. Since then, they've all died out. If we're all getting older, and attrition and issues like PTSD and Agent Orange sort of decimated our ranks.
I, my friends, am going to look them up after I'm done with this and see if I can make a donation.
Down in the States, they'd go to Veterans Affairs there and get treatment. It was a reciprocal agreement between First World War, Second World War, and Korea. But there was a glitch in the system that Vietnam veterans weren't eliminated from this process. We had to get an act in Congress changed so Vietnam veterans would also get the treatment on both sides of the border. Really big support down there. They set up all the meetings, and everything went really well. There was no opposition to it. It was just more of a paperwork issue of getting this passed through Congress. Within a year and a half, it was signed by the President of the United States. Congressman Lane Evans, he was one of the main driving forces behind the initiative for us. He was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and he helped push it through.
So that was the thing that really, I guess, got us going.
Well, we have our memorial wall. And on our wall, we have, I think it's 149 names of Canadians that were killed in Vietnam right now. We've taken her to Calgary and quite a few places, veterans events in the States, and one of the biggest comments, or the biggest comment we always get is, I didn't know Canadians served in Vietnam. It's just not known, and whether it's in Canada or the United States.
It isn't. It isn't even among those of us who are relatively well informed about war history and military history. It's not known. And I'm hoping that my little contribution on my little channel is helping remedy that.
Are you shocked?
Nobody knows about Canadians that served. We just went across the border and blended in with the Americans. I didn't know other Canadians joined till later, 16 years later.
Controversial and potentially dangerous chemical defoliant was tested in Canada by the American Army. The Canadian military has confirmed that it helped with the New Brunswick tests in 1966. The experiments at Base Gagetown have set off a major controversy. The New Brunswick Minister of Health is promising an investigation, and so is the Armed Forces Surgeon General.
The war, I've been back for 54 years, and the war caught up to me. And Parkinson's, eventually it's going to get worse and worse and worse. I feel fortunate that it didn't strike me till this age. But that war will never let us go. Not till the last one of us is gone.
I didn't know any of that, especially Canada's involvement in helping develop Agent Orange. Interesting, very interesting.
Why go back to Vietnam?
Yes, I went back there in 93. I sort of just woke up one day and I told my wife I'm going to go back to Vietnam, and she says, well, you're not going back without me.
How did it feel?
It was like going into a time warp. I never really made it back to some of the areas I served in because they were off limits at the time. I went and visited the area where my friend Larry got killed. I went to the tunnels of Cu Chi, and while I was there, a fellow that was touring us around right at the tunnels of Cu Chi, he served in a NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and we all sat down at a picnic table and had a beer together. The people were very nice. I've got no animosity against the South Vietnamese people. The whole trip was very therapeutic, and I think even for my wife to try and understand what I went through, and my son.
There was a movement in the 1980s to sort of redress the wrongs that were perpetrated, against the way Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home. And I imagine, unfortunately, probably didn't really happen in Canada because there was so few of them that were known to have gone there. So I can see why this is something that, these guys really needed. They needed the support. They needed the therapy. They needed to go back and deal with or whatever they particularly needed. He needed to go back and visit the place where it all happened. They needed something.
When we first came out, Canadian Vietnam veterans were not accepted as members in the Royal Canadian Legion. One time we had a little service at the convention center, and somebody from the Canadian Legion invited us back to their local post, and the president or post commander, they told us we weren't welcome in the Legion, and we were dressed in our jackets and ties and with our wives, and they told us, get off the steps and get off the property. They come up with that article in the paper, and we never asked for any plaques. We don't know where that came from, but the Legion said they don't want any plaques put on government buildings for Canadian Vietnam veterans. They considered us mercenaries and traitors and a lot of other nasty words. And I'll never understand why. To this day, I still don't understand why the animosity between a lot of those Second World War vets and us.
They weren't mercenaries. They didn't. Soldiers of fortune, were no Wagner group. They received a scant military pay, risked their lives. They went there in good faith.
How do you feel when they say you can't serve two masters? Is that fair to say? They're kind of saying here, it says here, if you're, they say you can't swear an oath to, you can't serve two masters.
But we weren't fighting against Canada. I mean, Canada was very heavily involved in the war in Vietnam, and so had a lot of other countries, Australia, New Zealand, the Koreans. There was a lot of other foreign troops there. And at the time, I believe we were fighting for the principles of freedom and democracy, the same as my father did.
All of those countries were allies of Canada at the time in other theaters around the world, and certainly, in NATO, we were allies of Canada. So, listen, I can understand both sides of the issue. I could understand it rubbing people the wrong way that you would go to another country and you have to become a citizen in order to fight in the army, and you do take an oath, and that does lead to the question of dual loyalties and whether you can serve two masters. But I think his answer to this is a good one. And in hindsight, there were probably passionate, anti-war feelings in Canada as well, and anti-American government with what was going on in the war, as there was here. So I can understand that why this happened. I think it's sad and a shame, and I'm glad that it looks to me like we are leading towards a positive resolution to this problem.
We thought we were serving Canada in our own way.
Manitoba Public Insurance, who takes care of insurance and vehicle insurance in the province of Manitoba, was issuing veterans plates. The criteria for getting a plate is you had to have served 3 years in the service or been in combat. I applied for and got a license plate, and about 11 months later I got a letter in the mail saying I had to turn my plates in because a mistake had been made. When I went to the Royal Canadian Legion and asked them, why am I having my plate taken away from me? Oh, there's technical problems. We can't tell you why. So I had to turn in my veterans plates. So now on the back of my truck I got support our troops. But there is a little extra story to this. My story went, I guess, somewhat viral. I get a set of license plates in the mail. Vietnam Veterans of America plates. The veteran that sent them heard my story. He says, I hope you'll be able to display one of these plates somewhere on your truck. The vet down in the States that read about that and thought that's a bunch of bullshit. I'm going to give him a set of my old plates. And he did.
I guess it's a complicated issue. Sad that there's the derision. I don't know what else to say about it.
Welcome to our Memorial Day Parade and Service. Today we honor all those who served in wars to defend our country. Throughout our history, young men and women have voluntarily left the safety and security of home, taken up arms to defend our freedoms and our way of life. The price of freedom is high. The sea of crosses that fill the military cemeteries in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia are a terrible reminder of the cost of war. Today we remember them, for sacrifice without remembrance is meaningless. Other party dismissed. Thank you all for attending our Memorial Day service.
This is the gravesite of my friend Larry Collins. He was killed May 1st in 1969. It brings back a lot of memories because I'll always remember Larry, very close and dear friend.
Looking back now, how do you feel about the war?
I'm still proud that I fought in it. The politics were crazy, but we were told that we were going to Vietnam to stop the communists. It was good enough for me. I mean, 21-year-old soldiers really aren't into politics. We hear something, okay, if that's why we're going, it sounds good to me.
Any regrets?
No regrets at all. We want people to realize the fact there was a lot of Canadians that served, but the fact that a lot of Canadians died. And we pass on the word that Canadians did serve. A lot of people think that Canada wasn't in a war from Korea to Afghanistan, which is a span of about 50 years. But there was a generation that served in Vietnam. And I think to a man, they will tell you, we believed we were fighting for Canada as well as the United States.
Yeah, Peter C. Lemon was the guy I was referring to before, and I just couldn't remember his name. Won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, my friends, well, that was very powerful. I really don't have any more to say than I've already commented as the video was going on, so I'm just going to leave you with that and your own thoughts on the subject, and certainly looking forward to your comments. All right, my friends, I will see you soon on to lighter topics. Take care, my friends.